Hey guys, it's Owen at Cafe de Paraiso. I am just posting a new video. Sorry for the delay. I've been just very busy with the holidays, and but I wanted to do a little series on each of my different coffee beans to kind of highlight the qualities of each one. And I wanted to highlight today my Brazil Natural bean, which is I would say probably the best coffee bean you could pick up if you are doing cold brew. And the reason I say that is that this bean has just had the most phenomenal feedback from customers. And I get a lot of drop-ins being here in Vegas, like people just traveling through town picking up coffee. And I also sell my cold brew and serve it at the downtown Summerlin Farmers Market. It's the largest farmers market in Vegas. And we also get a ton of just like tourists passing through. So we get a lot of feedback from people who just, are traveling through Vegas, trying out a cold brew. And I've had people say that they've, traveled all over the country, tried cold brew in like every city, and they've never had a cold brew this good before. Now, everyone has varying levels of preferences and like, experience with cold brew coffee, and all coffee is really just boils down to personal preference. So there's no way to say like absolutely this is the best, because for every single person it really just matters what did they think, what do they like, what sings to them. But I have some ideas as to why this Brazil Natural coffee that I sell is just so amazing for cold brew. Cold brew, by the way, it's one of the more easy ways to brew coffee. And what's so kind of convenient about it is that after you've made cold brew, it stays good up to 2 weeks in your fridge. So as long as you keep it refrigerated, you can make a larger batch and then not have to brew coffee the rest of the week and just drink from that batch that you made. You can't do that with hot coffee. So that's pretty awesome and flexible, and it's like really good versatile reason why, if you're not a cold brew drinker, you should take a look at this, because it's pretty awesome. And the other benefits from cold brew is it actually has less acid. When you brew coffee, there's this molecule called acetic acid that forms when heat is applied to the coffee and water. And so if you're brewing cold brew, because it's not touching heat, you're just basically steeping the grinds in the water. It's imbuing it with the water soluble elements in the coffee. You are getting it with a lower amount of acid than if you were to brew it hot. So what's that mean? Well, that's part of the reason why it's more stable and why it can last longer. That acid can cause bitterness, which is why, like, if you have a hot coffee pot sitting on like a heater pad after it's brewed, the longer it sits there on that heat pad, the more that acetic acid molecule builds up. So then what that means is that, when you're brewing hot coffee, try not to have it on a heat pad. Instead, use a coffee machine that has some thermos you can put the coffee in, so it stays hot based on its own, thermodynamics, that it's just holding itself hot, as opposed to applying more heat into it. Well, anyway, this coffee, why is this one good? So because there's less acid in cold brew, the cold brew experience tends to feel more smooth in your mouth as a mouth feel. Different acids, there's lots of different organic acids that happen in coffee, like malic acid that's in apples that makes acid kind of, hit your tongue. That's also in coffee, for example. So naturally, cold brew is going to have a little bit less acid. Doesn't mean it's not going to have those organic acids present. Doesn't mean it's not going to be pH acidic. It's still going to be that, but it's going to be an experience that's a little smoother in your mouth. And it's a little bit easier to brew at a higher concentrate, use more coffee, and not have it go to waste. For example, you can make a really dense cold brew, and then you could just put a little bit of that into some other drink, and you get the power of the coffee without having it take up a lot of volume in the drink. But so this bean in particular, why is this one cool? Is this bean, believe it or not, it's not a very like high characteristic, like bright acidic coffee. And bright and acidic are actually, positive attributes with coffee. Typically when you're brewing as a hot brew, like for drip or pour over, uh, people want sometimes that natural acidic flavor that kind of opens your mouth, it lights up your tongue, and it helps kind of make the flavor really jump around and is exciting and lively. So having different organic acids, having like a lively, bright coffee that lights up the tip of your tongue, that's usually really great on a hot coffee. But for a cold brew, if you have a coffee that doesn't do that when it's brewed hot, if you're brewing it as a cold brew, then those acids that are normally as they're there for a hot coffee, when you brew it cold, sometimes those can go bitter, sometimes they can kind of ring different because there's maybe more concentration of it, or there's possibly other organic chemistry stuff going on that I'm not aware of. But basically this coffee is a very simple flavor tone of cacao, and it's like, I call it just like a simple bitter cacao. But when you brew it as a cold brew, it can actually be like the smoothest coffee you've ever had as a cold brew. And I think part of it is that this coffee doesn't have that brightness when brewed as a hot coffee. It's just like very simple. And I think part of that is the fact that it's from Brazil. It's Brazil's very like kind of monotone monoculture in its coffee production, similar to like big agricultural states in the United States like Iowa, where I'm from, where they have the growing of the corn and the growing of the soybeans down to a science, where basically the flavor consistency is going to be very strict across the board. And they've really gotten it down to a science on how to just produce the product over the years with kind of the least amount of additional input to save money, and yet still come out with like a consistent quality, but without, let's say, the sweet, higher elevation benefits you'll get from like hand-picked super ripe cherries of coffee that have like these really bright characteristics from soil that has, all these other characters, all these other kind of terroir flavor tones that are lively and have something to say. So and that's not to say that in a cold brew you can't have a good experience that way, but the reason why this thing is so great is because it creates this super smooth, simple chocolate flavor tone when you brew this as cold brew. And on top of that, that simple flavor tone without complexity really it creates this amazing palette onto which you can add any other flavors or sweeteners, or essentially if you're adding any cream or introducing anything else to your coffee, which a lot of people will do usually as a cold brew, it's not going to interfere with that. It's like, it's this super suave, simple black tone of that cacao that's just gonna be like buttery for you. And I think that's part of what makes it amazing. I would say too, some of the other factors in making a cold brew, because I've had customers who had tasted my cold brew that I made with this and said it just wasn't the same. And I think some of the factors are, and really important, would be like grind size, the total brew time you're using, the type of water, which I'd recommend using like a spring water. You could do like a filtered tap, but I'd recommend getting a type of mineral water. Definitely never use distilled water for coffee unless you're planning on adding some type of like sodium or other water soluble minerals to it, because water for coffee needs minerals. So the minerals that carry the flavor, which is kind of like with like perfume or other things like that, you need some type of carrier to carry the flavor to kind of make it like volatile, so it like is like turning into a gas and you're smelling it. So that happens a lot with this, and some of it's also how it interacts with your tongue in your mouth. But long story short, so I would use like a coarse grind. I like to do 8 to 14 hours brew time, which is basically an overnight brew. You could do this in a French press, but the challenge with the French press is you don't have a paper filtration, and paper filtration really helps get the grinds out. And I found that the clarity and smoothness of this coffee really increases when you remove the actual physical beans. That's the ground coffee that was floating around in the water when you're brewing it as cold brew. You want to get rid of that, and the paper filter is just really efficient, as long as it doesn't have holes. So I would use like perhaps a strainer bag, and then that holds the paper filter, which then holds the weight of the coffee. So you could do it. You can buy devices from all over the place. Cold brew devices are everywhere. I use the toddy system, which is like basically a bucket, and then you put in first the strainer, which covers the whole lining of the bucket. So basically it's still a bucket, and then it happens to have a strainer covering all of the inside. Then you put in a paper filter that's also the same size of the whole container that goes in. And then you just take all your coffee, pour it in. And I use a ratio of like 1 pound of coffee for every 1 gallon of water you're using. Then once that's in, creates a slurry after you add your water. So you just dump in the coffee, dump in the water, stir it up to make sure all the coffee's actually touching the water, and then you maybe wait a little bit, maybe stir it again, because sometimes you'll have coffee floating to the top. As long as the goal is to have all the coffee experiencing being submerged in the water. Because otherwise, why put it in? The whole point is it's getting wet and it's soaking, just like tea leaves in a tea. You want it to be soaking in it and steeping at room temperature or refrigerator temperature if you want. I do that 8 to 14 hours at a room temperature outside of the fridge. But then once I finish the brew the next day, then after straining it, which is basically you grab the strainer and the paper filter, and you can lift it out, put a colander or strainer on top, set it there, let it drip. Or some of the devices will have a little spout, or it's just got a container, you just pull the thing out of there. But the goal is to basically, pull that out, and then try to have a way, hopefully that you're using a paper filter, that it got rid of the grinds. If you don't get rid of the grinds, that's okay. What I've noticed is the grinds will be kind of floating around. It'll make the cold brew murky. If you wait a couple hours, what you'll notice is the very super fine sediment that even paper filters don't catch, that will settle to the very bottom of the container. And that's actually a benefit, because instead of using like super high tech filtration equipment, gravity's doing that for you. So eventually the coffee grinds, the super fine particles are going to sit at the bottom, and everything you have above that is going to be really high clarity cold brew that's going to taste amazing and be super smooth. And then it's really boils down to personal preference, how you want to dilute that. What I'll typically do is, when I said that 1 gallon of water to 1 pound of coffee, what I mean is, in a device, when you put in a pound of coffee in a gallon jug, it's displacing a lot of space. Like, you can't actually fill that gallon with a gallon of water, because there's a bunch of coffee, whole pound of coffee is in that gallon. So after the brewing process, and I take out the wet grinds and try to get all the coffee that's in them out, like drip them back into there, and then you can recycle or compost or whatever with those coffee grinds. Then what you have left over is actually more concentrated than the ratio I mentioned. So you might want to save it in the concentrated version. It'll actually stay fresh longer that way. And then when you're going to drink it, you could dilute it. Or at that time, you could dilute it by adding more water to bring it to that 1 gallon to 1 pound ratio, which is what I use. So that's how I do it. You guys have to try this. If you're doing cold brew, please check this coffee out. It is like the bomb, amazing, nuts, bonkers. You got to try it at least once. I would order it whole bean from me, or if you're ordering ground, I would order coarse. But really, the grind size, oftentimes, all these factors really boil down to personal preference. If you've done this a lot, if you haven't, then maybe buy it. Ideally, you'd be grinding your own coffee fresh before doing it. If you don't have a grinder, yes, you could order it ground, and you could say you want it coarse ground, which is what I'd recommend for cold brew. It just helps with the filtration process, and having a finer grind is actually going to sometimes impede the whole process, because when coffee gets really fine, it becomes this mud that water can't even pass through. So you want a coarser grind so water can flow through it. and the coarse grind is going to be just fine on a long brew time for cold brew. So Owen at Cafe de Paraiso, this is the Brazil natural cold brew coffee. It's amazing. If you're into cold brew, you've got to try this thing at least once. And I think if you do as a cold brew and you've got some settings dialed in, I think this thing is going to knock your socks off. So please check it out. If you guys have any questions or comments about cold brew, or you want to tell me what's been your favorite cold brew or how you brew your cold brew, please let me know in the comments below the video. And I hope to catch you guys on my next coffee highlight video. Thank you so much.